Hi guys, in this quick video here I want to go over a few of the things about argumentation that you will have read in the introduction to Russ Shafer-Landau's The Fundamentals of Ethics. So part of the reason we're going to sort of focus on this is because our methodology in philosophy is sort of argumentation, that we don't typically engage in sort of empirical demonstration as you would find in the natural sciences, but instead we engage in sort of rational scrutiny. And so we need to sort of understand what sort of arguments are and get a sense on how to evaluate them. So to begin, just a few things about arguments, and hopefully a lot of this is stuff that you have had before or are familiar with, and we're just kind of familiarizing you with them again. But we just want to start with the idea that arguments are made out of claims. Claims are just sort of sentences with truth value. So sometimes I'll refer to these as propositions or statements or declaration, but a claim is just any sentence that could be sort of either true or false. So a couple examples here of some true claims are all cats are mammals and snow is white. And then here's a claim that is, I believe, false, that the earth is flat. So an argument is a set of claims, one of which that we sort of identify as the things that are being argued for, which we call the conclusion, is intended to be supported by the others, the premises. So anytime that you have an argument, you have at least one conclusion, or the thing that you're sort of making a case for, and at least one sort of premise, something that is meant to support that conclusion. And the idea is that if you're making sort of an argument, what's going on is that there is an inference, that you are drawing a conclusion sort of based on those premises. So here's an example of an argument. We got a couple premises here and a conclusion. This is something that is sort of relevant to our course. It's about fetuses. So somebody may argue that the conclusion that fetuses do not have moral value, based on the premises that only rational individuals have moral value, and that fetuses are not rational individuals. So the claim is that you should draw this inference based on these premises. Here's another example, also kind of relevant to the material that we're talking about in class. Anything unnatural is morally wrong. Painless childbirth is unnatural. Therefore, painless childbirth is morally wrong. So the conclusion here is intended to be supported by the premises, even if you don't believe them. So in this case, at least personally, I don't believe that anything unnatural is morally wrong. But if you did, I would give you some reason to believe the conclusion. And finally, example number 3, it is never permissible to violate someone's autonomy. Another premise is that conducting experiments on humans without consent violates their autonomy. And the conclusion, or the inference that you would draw, would be that conducting such experiments is not permissible. So these are all arguments. We haven't really sort of said whether or not they're good or what makes them good, but just that they are arguments. There's a conclusion, something being sort of argued for, and in all 3 cases there are 2 premises, 2 reasons that are being offered to get you to sort of accept that conclusion. Okay, so the other thing we need to talk about then is how to evaluate the arguments or the inferences. So there's actually sort of two questions that you're going to ask yourself with any sort of argument. And the first is pretty straightforward, which is just, are the premises true? Um, so this is sort of a necessary condition that if you're going to make an argument, you have to at least say true things, right? So if you're offering a premise that is false or that you don't have good reason to believe, um, then it's not going to do a lot of work. So that's the first question, and that sort of requires the least amount of explanation. But the second question is a little more sort of tricky. So the second thing that we sort of ask ourselves is whether or not the conclusion follows logically from those premises. Um, which is a question about the logic of the argument. And in the case of sort of the arguments that we'll be looking at for the most part here, we're going to be asking questions about whether or not the argument is valid or that the inference is valid. And then the idea is that, well, if both of those questions, the answer to both of those questions is yes, then we say that the argument is sound. This is kind of the goal, is a sound argument. That if you have a sound argument, then that's it. That's what you need. You have a rationally impeccable argument, and you should believe the conclusion. So, just want to sort of make a note here before talking more about validity, that validity, this sort of following logically in this one sense, works on what we call deductive inferences. That if you're engaged in deductive reasoning, you're looking to have valid inferences. But there are sort of non-deductive inferences as well. In philosophy, we tend to refer to these as inductive inferences. But those kinds of inferences are not as sort of prevalent in philosophy and ethics. So you find inductive inferences more in sort of the empirical regions where you base your conclusions on sort of empirical evidence. So in this video, we're not going to talk about induction all that much, but we might sort of make reference to it sort of later on. So I just wanted to make note of it here. Okay, so we're talking about validity, that what it means for a conclusion to logically follow from the premises. This is that second question here. Is about truth guarantees, that an argument inference is valid when the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. So another way to sort of think about that is to say that if the premises of a valid argument are true, then the conclusion must be true, right? It's the idea is that not only does the conclusion kind of follow from these premises, but it follows in such a way that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. It's necessity. And then so anything that isn't that we call sort of an invalid argument, and it's just one where the premises do not have that guarantee. So even if the premises are true, it would be possible for the conclusion to be false. So in ethics and philosophy, this feature, this validity, is a feature of it typically is a feature of the underlying sort of structure or pattern of the argument. So in a lot of cases, we can sort of say that the argument is valid just by kind of looking at the pattern that the argument follows. One other thing that we have to sort of say here is that, and this is kind of the trickiest for most people, is that valid arguments can actually have false premises. Remember, there's these two questions. One is, are the premises true? And the other is, does the conclusion sort of follow logically from those premises? So that opens up to, the door to the possibility that your answer to question one is no, but your answer to question 2 is yes. So that you find yourself in a situation where the argument is valid, or we say that it's valid despite the fact that it has a false premise. So that can be weird for a lot of people, and I'll try to at least once use an example where we have a valid pattern, but we don't have all true premises. So again, bear in mind that you want both. You want an argument that has a valid pattern or is valid, and actually has true premises. So let's just talk about a couple of valid patterns, some very common valid patterns and very simple ones, just to get kind of a sense of how this sort of works out. So one of the very common valid patterns is called modus ponens. And a modus ponens argument, the Latin translates to sort of the method of affirming. But essentially what's going on is an argument that's trying to sort of reference a sufficient condition for something. So a sufficient condition is just a condition such that it's sort of a hypothetical that if it were to come about, then you would expect some sort of consequence. So oftentimes we refer to these sentences as conditional sentences. So if you look on the screen here, you see that there's a conditional sort of if P then Q. And the P here is the sufficient condition that we sometimes call an antecedent. And the P is just sort of a stand-in for any claim, that any sentence that has sort of truth value, you can put that into P. And if it's a sufficient condition, then you could plug in something for Q that would be sort of a consequent of that condition. So a conditional has these sort of two pieces, sort of the first part, which we call sort of the antecedent, or the sufficient condition, and then the second part, which we call the consequent, and which is also, logically speaking, sort of the necessary condition. And we'll talk about that more here in a second. But anyway, if you can have this argument then that kind of follows this pattern, that you have a premise that is this sort of conditional sentence, if P then Q, where P and Q just sort of stand for some claims. And then your second premise would be sort of P, and your conclusion would be Q. So anything that kind of follows this pattern turns out is a valid inference that if your two premises are true, the conclusion will always be true. So anything that follows this pattern counts as a valid argument, even if the premises aren't all true. So here's an example of a valid argument that just happens to have premises that are not all true. So let's just kind of look at the pattern here on the example that we say, well, if cows can read, so if P, then they have moral worth. So let's just assume that premise is true. We could talk about whether or not that would be really true maybe sort of later, but for now let's just sort of say that's true. Follows this pattern, this sort of conditional pattern. And then we have this other premise that is, I think, is false, that sort of cows can read. But nevertheless, it's following this pattern, right? It's the P from the modus ponens, excuse me, from the conditional above. So if cows can read, then they have moral worth, right? If P then Q, then we have P, right? Cows can read. And then the conclusion is Q. Like the conclusion continues to follow this pattern, is that cows have moral worth. So what we say about this is that the argument is valid, but it's not sound, right? It has sort of a valid pattern. It's such that if the premises were both true, the conclusion would have to be true. But it just so happens to be that the premises are not both true. So it's a valid argument that isn't sound. So just bear that in mind, right? You need both. But that said, modus ponens is valid. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. So an invalid inference, something that looks very similar to modus ponens, would just be what you would get if you were to flip that second premise and the conclusion, right? If you were to say as a premise Q and as a conclusion sort of P. So this argument here in red is an invalid argument, that arguments that sort of follow this pattern are such that even if both of your premises are true, it's not always a guarantee that the conclusion will be true, right? The conclusion may be true, but it won't be guaranteed by those premises. So what that means is even if the premises are true, the conclusion could still be false. So here's an example of something that follows this invalid pattern, and you know it has true premises, but you still end up with sort of a false conclusion. So in this case, this is about me, Tim Hansel, and the first premise is true that if I were to live in Milwaukee, then I would live in Wisconsin, assuming Milwaukee is the Milwaukee we're talking about is the one that's in Wisconsin. And the second premise is true. I live in Wisconsin. That is true. But the conclusion that I live in Milwaukee is false. So here's an argument. It's following this pattern, right? If P, then Q. Q, therefore P. But you end up with a situation where, well, the premises are true, but you still have sort of a false conclusion. So so here's just an example of sort of a pattern that doesn't work, as opposed to the one above, the modus ponens pattern, that does work. So the modus ponens pattern is valid, but this pattern below, for what we call sort of affirming the consequent, is not. So another pattern that is fairly common and also sort of utilizes the conditional and the notion of sufficient and necessary conditions is modus tollens. So modus tollens, or necessary condition arguments, are ones that kind of focus on the consequent of a conditional, and here we have, I've written the conditional in a sort of slightly different way just to kind of focus your attention on the Q here. But if you say, if you were thinking more in terms of necessary conditions, your conditional is oftentimes rewritten with the only if. So you say, instead of saying if P then Q, you say P only if Q, just so you can see that the Q is the thing here that we're focusing on. So if you have a sentence that's P only if Q, and essentially what you're saying is Q is the necessary condition for P, and you know that Q is not true, or not the case, then you can infer that P is not the case. So this is another valid inference, and we call it modus tollens, the method of denial. So here's an example of something that sort of follows this pattern, and in this case, I've also just sort of used premises that are actually true, so you can kind of see a little bit more clearly how you get this sort of guarantee. So P only if Q, we have a number is even only if it's divisible by 2. So that's just sort of from the definition of an even number, that an even number must be divisible by 2. So we have this another premise is that, well, 3 is not divisible by 2, and so that's the not Q, and then in this case we know that 3 is not even. So here's a valid pattern. If both of those premises are true, and I think they are, then the conclusion must be true. And again, pretty common pattern here. It's something that you're going to see fairly often, given that we talk in terms of necessary conditions for a lot of things, and so this is a good pattern to know. But just like the modus ponens pattern, there is an invalid version of this, which just involves sort of flipping the second premise and the conclusion, that if you say P only if Q, but not P, and try to conclude sort of not Q, that doesn't work, or at least it doesn't work with any logical guarantee. So here's an example of that not working. So despite following this pattern in red, that you can join the meeting only if you have access to the internet, right? Assume that that's true, and assume that you did not join the meeting. You cannot assume that you did not have access to the internet, right? So even if both of those premises were true, it's possible that conclusion is still false, right? It's possible in this case that you didn't join the meeting for some other reason, right? So maybe you forgot, right? Or maybe you didn't want to join the meeting, or maybe you died, or something like that. That all these sorts of are other possibilities could have been true, even if you accept both of those premises. So that's invalidity, right? Invalidity is such that even if your premises are true, the conclusion could still be false. Whereas with a valid argument, like the one above, if both of those premises are true, the conclusion has to be true, right? There's kind of like no way around it. It's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. All right, so we're going to wrap up here. I just want to say a few final things before moving on. After this presentation, if you have questions, I encourage you to go to Blackboard, and there'll be a place for you to talk about the introduction, the Rush Shafer-Landau introduction, and feel free to ask any questions about this argument stuff. So let me just sort of end with a few things. First thing I just want to remind everybody is that remember, if we have an argument that is sound, which is to say that it is both a valid argument or follows a valid pattern, and has true premises, then you should believe the conclusion. Otherwise, you're being irrational. The second thing I want to say is that most of the arguments that we'll look at or will be presented with can be presented in a logically valid form. And we should try to do that. We should always try to get sort of the logic of the argument right first, and then we can move on to whether or not those premises are actually true. But that ends up being sort of the trick, is that where it's hard to get both, right? It's hard to get an argument that is logically valid and has true premises. So it's typically easy to make it valid, but then you end up with sort of a false premise. Or it's easy to come up with true premises, but it's hard to make the logic valid. But usually the direction that we go is we start by making the argument valid, and then ask ourselves whether or not the premises are actually true. Another thing to sort of mention is that arguments can get sort of very complex, that once you present even a very sort of simple modus tollens argument, as soon as that argument is sort of presented, it's reasonable to ask why you would believe any of those premises, right? Why, for instance, should I believe that cows can read? And when presented with that question, typically what you're asking for is another argument, right? Some reason to believe that that premise is true. And so for each premise sort of being offered, you might find yourself in another argument. So thus complexity. And then we'll sort of end with this, because you're going to see that outside of this introduction that you've just read, it's fairly rare that people will sort of make their arguments explicit, which is to say it's rare that somebody will just, sit down and write their arguments out. A philosopher like Russ does, a philosopher like myself does. There are a few people who do this, but for the most part, you don't see it. And so a lot of the work in figuring out whether or not somebody's argument is any good is kind of teasing out what the argument is, and doing that sort of evaluation. So this is something that throughout the semester we're going to try to do. We're going to try to kind of figure out sort of explicitly what an author's argument is. So we read somebody like Don Marquis, who argues that most abortions are seriously immoral things, and we try to figure out, so well, what is his argument, right? What is his argument sort of in a nutshell? And we won't sort of go into it right now, but eventually we're going to talk about what that is, and whether or not um, his argument is valid and has true premises, right? Is argument sound? Okay, so that's it for now. Like I said, if you have any questions, go to the Blackboard discussion thread about this reading, and ask away, and we'll talk more about it there. So thanks for coming.